The Athletic.
MotoGP starts 2025 with huge uncertainty around one of its most important manufacturers. Not that a series with 5 manufacturers can have an unimportant one, really, at the moment, but KTM for years has been the manufacturer that you thought would have all the investment to make it to the top, to challenge Ducati's supremacy, the manufacturer that has the next massive star of MotoGP on its books in Pedro Acosta, the manufacturer that is so important to the talent pipeline and the junior classes. And we have no idea how much longer KTM is going to be on the grid, and quite a lot of skepticism over that being anything longer than the very short term. This is the Race MotoGP Podcast. I'm Matt Beer. With me are Val Khorounzhiy and Simon Patterson. Sorry, in a way, listeners, to be starting 2025 on a bit of a downer with a story of big uncertainty and jeopardy surrounding a really important part of the paddock. But there's been so much happening in the background with this KTM story over Christmas that we wanted to revisit it straight away. So, Val, what has been going on over the couple of weeks since we were last on air in the KTM financial situation?
I mean, not a lot has been going on. It's more things that are already underway have seemingly been drip feeding out into the public. And what we do know now from various, well, no is a strong word. I think no is not really a word that we can use here. But what we do know now from the interaction of various Austrian media reports and creditor union reports and the responses from KTM is that KTM will race in 2025, but then there's a really big question mark over 2026 and an even bigger question mark over 2027, but even more so than before. The Austrian, I believe, paper of record, their standard, has reported that as part of the self-administration process that KTM is in due to its insolvency, it has already been decided that the MotoGP program cannot continue. I mean, they said in 2026. It's that part's still a little bit confusing to me personally, because financially, again, like if you were KTM and you had decided to exit, 2027 would be the obvious time. That's when its Dorna contract runs out, as does every other manufacturer's. That's where the new regulations come in, so you need to develop a new bike. Whereas 2026, still there's going to be massive carryover, especially with the engine freeze introduced at the start of the season and taking us to 2027. And all the rider contracts are signed through 2026 inclusive. However, it's manufacturers we're talking about, and it's the MotoGP budget isn't a drop in the ocean for KTM, but sometimes we've seen it over and over again. When a manufacturer has to go, it goes.
Yeah,
and it figures out a financial way to go without still keeping its brand represented, because oftentimes it's not just about the money; it's also about the visual of continuing to compete. In which case, but if that was the situation, then you'd just leave right now. And then you'd figure out, sort of a financial way to just pay slightly less than the expenditure and go right now. KTM is committed to competing in 2025. It has not officially said anything about 2026 or 2027. For all we know, the plans, are still ongoing. The development is still ongoing for 2027. They could never publicly say something like that, given the situation with their finances. I'm not super optimistic, but we can't know for sure yet. But again, I already, before all these reports, I didn't see 2027 as making sense for KTM in this situation. The manufacturer has no money.
Yeah.
So how are we going to sign up to a new regulation cycle in the most expensive motorcycling series in the world if there's no cash? You're going to have to completely rely on outside investment at that point, and then you're probably not even going to be called KTM. It's not, from all the reporting, I would say it's not looking fantastic, but it's hard to say without actually knowing what specifically the creditor, the administrator in charge of self-administration, Peter Fogel, is thinking and is presenting to Austrian courts, which I think the next step will be around late February or something, where that plan gets firmed up. For now, what definitely has happened is KTM has at least secured the continuation of its existence, rather than being just picked apart into pieces by creditors who just want some sort of return now.
The most
promising thing for me, the best bit of news that's come out of all of this, is the administrator coming out and saying, like, look, fundamentally this company is sound. There has been some bad management decisions, but, you know, KTM isn't going to suddenly go bust if we get a proper restructuring plan in progress. And I think that kind of hints for me that it's not all doom and gloom, because I get the impression that a lot of what's happening right now is kind of kicking the can down the road, because, you know, they've said the entire road racing program costs them, I think, 43 million euros a season, something like that, which is, don't get me wrong, which is a lot of money. But in the grand scheme of owing 3 billion, it's a drop in the pan. It's a tiny, tiny amount in the grand scheme of things. So if they deem that there's a solid argument for having a MotoGP program as a marketing strategy going forwards, then I get the impression that what we're watching right now is people trying to delay the inevitable until a point where it isn't inevitable anymore. They're trying to say, right, let's see what happens. We've already built the bikes for this year. We've already built the bikes for next year. Let's see where we are with the company's finances and what development we've done with the 850 for 2027. At the end of the day, they've got, well over a year before we're going to have to start thinking about rider contracts for next season. You would imagine that, given the work that we know they've already done, which is quite a bit, if they have to pause all development of the 850 until March of next year, it's still possible to get a good bike in the grid by the end of the season. So, yeah, I think we're in a bit of stasis at the minute. We're in a bit of a holding pattern to see what effect the administration has over the next 9 months before they make much in the way of strong decisions going forward.
I'm intrigued by that idea that we're now in this kind of let's buy some time phase. That was something that hadn't necessarily occurred to me. I was thinking this is going to, in terms of delaying the inevitable, I was thinking they will try to bury the bad news for as long as possible, but the idea that actually they could hold it off long enough that maybe it is okay to carry on racing is definitely an encouraging thought if they can pull that off. And that's not to minimize the effect of the company's plight generally. We had Marcus Zorweg from Motorsport Magazine on with us in a KTM episode we did in December, which, if you haven't heard that one, listeners, is well worth checking out. He has brilliant insight from Austria on the effects that the KTM financial problems and when it looked like a potential collapse could have on the region was absolutely huge. There's a huge human side to this as well that is more important than whether we see these bikes on the grid. But companies do go racing for a reason. MotoGP is an industry in itself with people employed in it. Obviously, we also want to see them carry on racing. So what happens next? There's been a lot of talk and speculation about outside investment and whether that could be the way forward. Obviously, I don't know how informed the speculation was, but given the long Red Bull KTM association, I think people jumped to the conclusion, Red Bull's got tons of money. Could they just buy KTM out and just solve all this? We'll get to Red Bull and other possibilities in a second, but the one that was reported quite heavily over Christmas was Lewis Hamilton getting involved. Now, I think we actually broke the story of Lewis Hamilton looking at Gresini last year in as potentially adding that to his portfolio of investments. He is a massive MotoGP fan, but little bit tenuous to say he's going to be KTM saviour, Simon?
Not a chance. So, simply put, Lewis Hamilton doesn't have saving KTM money. He's got a lot of money, but he doesn't have the money that they need to fix this problem. He doesn't have 3 billion euros to chuck at a project. The only way in which I can see Lewis Hamilton getting seriously involved in this, if we're going to see some sort of a rump KTM remnant team for the next 2 seasons with a really strong commitment not to go racing in 2027, like Kawasaki did in their last year of existence when it became Hayate.
Oh, yeah.
And they ran the bikes basically as privateers for the last season. Mm. The only way I can see Lewis coming in is to do something like that, because almost more importantly than getting a foot in the door, he gets grid spots. He would own the grid spots for going forward. And then there's a value to that, because then it allows you to do whatever you want, in 27 and recruit new manufacturer or whatever. But right now, I don't think he has the financial ability to come in and be the savior to this, unless they decide to spin it off. I think we're far more likely to see the racing program saved as an extension of a wider company saving deal that will not come from an individual or probably from an energy drink. It'll come from an already big player within the motorbike manufacturing industry like Bajaj in India or CF Moto in China, who are both already big KTM partners who supply quite a bit of stuff to KTM, who are probably owed quite a bit of money right now by KTM, given that. I think they're the people that have the multi-billion euro financial clout to be players in this conversation.
Yeah, the Lewis Hamilton thing came up also through Pit Buyer, KTM's motorsport boss, telling Speedweek.com, the Red Bull-owned German language publication, about it, and seemingly like going by the way that copy is structured, almost bringing it up unprompted, but certainly it was certainly something they wanted out there. Like that's not the kind of thing that comes out from one of your program chiefs if you don't want it out there publicly. If those talks were like super advanced, I would be very surprised if that's something you publicize.
Yeah, true.
So it's more a way, I think, to position yourselves on the market as like, yep, we're very actively seeking outside investors, and the best way to do that is to get Lewis Hamilton in some of the headlines. Even if you are talking to Lewis Hamilton at that point, Hamilton would not be, I can't imagine he'd be like a single investor or anything like that. With his experience of, sports team ownership, I mean, he was bidding for my football club Chelsea at one point as part of an investment group, if I remember correctly. He is part of the ownership team of the Denver Broncos NFL outfit, but he's not like a majority owner or anything like that. He's just one of the many investors there as part of an investment group, and that you would have to imagine that would also, even though it's a much smaller scale type of operation. So obviously the Denver Broncos are like what, a billion dollar operation, but with MotoGP it'd be less money, but he'd still just be one of the people coming in as part of your, I would imagine, your American venture capital type of firm that comes in, sort of does what it can in the situation with the view to then sell it on at a profit. It is usually primarily a business oriented situation of getting a return on investment rather than the way manufacturers go racing right now for publicity, or the way racers go racing, which is we can take a loss but we just got to be on track. I mean, it would be really cool. The thing is, you kind of want to believe the Lewis Hamilton thing. You would like Hamilton MotoGP team on the MotoGP grid. I think that would be incredible. It'd be incredible for MotoGP, and to, if the Liberty takeover was rubber stamped right this second, for instance, and if I was Liberty Media, I'd go to Lewis and be like, we'll front most of the cash for this team. Can we have your name, your presence, your likeness for it, please? Thank you. And figure out a deal there. I think that would be phenomenal. But it sounds complicated to me, especially given what KTM is. This isn't just a privateer team we're talking about that's leasing bikes from a manufacturer. This is a established manufacturer entry. Lewis Hamilton is not going to buy the Mattighofen factory floors, is he?
Without meaning to disparage Pit Buyer in any way, I've been in situations before where party A has said, oh yes, we're talking, and then I've went to ask party B and they've said, well, they're talking and we're listening.
Yeah.
that has happened before in racing, and there might be an element of that. The weird thing is we've never really done the F1 model in MotoGP, with the exception of Kenny Roberts, where you have a team that doesn't build motorbikes, but who builds essentially a factory MotoGP bike.
Yeah.
That's, and that's pretty common in F1. I think that's how most of the grid operate in F1. And we've never really done that. That's never really been the model here. So, maybe there is Liberty involvement, or at least a conversation happening with them and Lewis and KTM and Dorna to look at that as being an option. But I can still only see it happening if we get to the point where KTM is essentially the racing department is spun off. And I don't think that KTM are really ready to spin off their racing department, because I don't think that's their... I don't think that will be the style of everyone within the company. And I think they're going to kind of drag their heels, like I said, on having that happen until the point where, someone tells them to.
Yeah, I think, is it fair to characterise the Hamilton MotoGP situation right now as it's not a case of, moving into his new house in Italy, the first thing Lewis does is wake up and go, have I got that MotoGP team yet? Phones his investment group and goes, have you bought whatever Honda is now? Or whatever. It's more a case of if a MotoGP team was to appear among Lewis Hamilton's investments very soon, that would not be a surprise given his interest, given Liberty, given the fact we know he had some conversations through his group around Grassini last year. But yeah, it's not like number 2 on his to-do list after buying more red clothes this month. So looking at KTM's immediate future, we'll get on in a moment to the riders and to what should happen if we are losing 4-2 bikes for 2026 or whenever. But KTM has now announced a launch event, which we imagine will be a digital launch like it has been in the last few years. So there won't be anything to read into that. The fact that going ahead with the launch is quite nice still in itself. There's been kind of deliberately carefully mixed messaging in the same kind of minute as some of these Austrian newspaper reports were coming out about the insolvency situation and the cessation of the racing program having to feature in that. KTM was sending out a press release saying, ready to race, we're carrying on, but worded so carefully that you could not be exactly sure how long, what they'd be racing, in which series, or anything, really. It is now safe for the coming season. That seems clear. But what KTM are we going to see on the grid this year? Will there be tangible impacts? When KTM turns up for pre-season testing, will this be a pared down team? Will this be a less competitive proposition, Simon?
I don't think we'll see a difference in pre-season testing, because I think the bike that is coming to pre-season testing was already well in progress before any of this happened. I think that we will see... Where we'll see the real impact of this is whenever we get to the Red Bull Ring.
Oh, yeah.
Halfway point in the season, after the summer break, their home race, where updates would normally appear, where there would maybe have been a wild card or two with someone super fast like Dani Pedrosa or Paul Espargaro to deliver a really surprising performance on a bike that it turns out is 2026 spec at that point. I think that's when we'll notice whether or not this is having an impact in the racing program. Not before, maybe before it, but we're talking days before it, months before it. Not the way that I think we're going to go to Sepang and have pretty much business as usual, at least to start the season.
I don't know that I agree with business as usual, because those guys have to face us every day, and the second you start talking about development, like almost, I would imagine the first question out of your mouth, out of somebody else's mouth at the start of the preseason testing was, so are you getting paid? Is the money in your bank account? Is there, did you fly here business or first class, or did you have to trek across the world on a bicycle to save budget on gasoline, etc.?
There's some MotoGP riders who quite like that opportunity.
Yeah, no. That's true. But I think, that's, regardless of the actual impact, firstly, there will be, it will be something being talked about extensively, heavily. It will take precisely 0.3 of a second for somebody to ask Pedro Acosta whether he's already looking for different suitors for 2027, for instance, which is also will be a fair question, because Pedro Acosta's management has publicly spoken about having its faith in KTM undercut by the developments. So game on, fair play. Let's see what your movements are on the rider market, Pedro. We'll get to that in a second. But so that cloud in terms of the public perception will hang over it. I'm really interested to see how MotoGP officially deals with that, for instance, because it's not something the sport will want to massively, put out there in public as part of broadcasts and stuff like that. But it's also not something you can really avoid mentioning, that one of the present manufacturers doesn't really have an obvious budget to spend right now. And I think, the further you go into the season, there's the money isn't there to spend. Even if there's outside investment from sponsors, obviously, and stuff like that, and that can go into the pot, but you can't supplement it in any way because the company is insolvent. It has to has an impact. I've heard the KTM higher ups public position of, will will only, spend on the bare necessities, and will shave off money with, putting people in a single hotel room instead of 2 hotel rooms, etc. Slightly less ostentatious presentations and stuff like that. And I think that only goes so far. I don't think that's going to provide the level of cost saving that is required in a situation where you do not have money, because the money is being held up by the fact that there's an administration process going on. And if you're going to spend that money that you do not have the right to at this point, I mean, you can't. So I think we're gonna see some interesting events, but I think what we're going to see more is riders having to talk over and over again about the situation, to the point where almost certainly KTM PR will go, okay, today we're not asking about the insolvency, and then somebody from the media will try anyway, because, well, how can you ask us not to ask about the elephant in the room, because he's standing right there.
Well, let's talk about the riders then. Pedro Acosta, Enea Bastianini, Brad Binder, Maverick Vinales. That is a ferocious lineup, even with the flaws that we know of in some of them. Those are 4 riders that will find homes somewhere else if they decide that whatever KTM becomes is not for them, or if there's no bike for them to ride at all. You don't want to be like a vulture over the rider lineup when the team itself is trying to survive, but inevitably these riders are thinking about what comes next. So that'll be a question as well, won't it? Straight away at Sepang testing, all 4 of those riders are going to be asked, how long are you going to be here? Where are you going next? What are your management doing? And there's been a few signs of that already in terms of what managers' views are, I guess, Val.
Yeah, and but I should say, by maybe, like, if you take by best rider, it isn't the best lineup in MotoGP, but by median rider and by worst rider, absolutely is. It is genuinely a very impressive collection of riders that you have all under factory contracts. And if there's somehow a situation where they all hit the open market in 2026, that's going to be madness. In 2027 is going to be insane anyway, whatever happens. All of the contracts expire, all the work shuffling is going to start again. We've already seen what that looks like, in cycle this year. But if it happens mid-cycle, which 2026 would represent, then obviously all the contracts existing on the grid would start getting stress tested, that kind of stuff. And Acosta is the key player there, because he is the prize asset. He is one of the 5 most attractive riders for the future on the grid, and he isn't number 5 and he isn't number 4 either.
No.
Or probably number 3 or number 2, if I'm being totally honest, as far as an asset that you can have goes. His manager, Albert Valera, had already made it clear that, every manufacturer had reached out in one way or the other. It might be hyperbolic. He might not be, genuinely. I mean, if I was a manufacturer, I'd reach out. I don't know what I would say exactly, because, again, as you say, Matt, you don't want to be a vulture, and certainly it is arguably in the interest of every MotoGP manufacturer not to have the KTM program implode. But at the same time, if you can't really help that anyway, then you if that is the situation that is happening, then you have to look very seriously at every rider that it employs. It's, we can't really, if KTM rights the ship, then all of this is polemic, basically. But even if there's any sign of weakness, that's also the point. That's also bringing back to the point that I said previously. It's what those guys are going to talk about when they talk about development, whether you can read an undercurrent of, I am unsatisfied with the situation in terms of the budget that's available. I am not satisfied maybe with the luxuries that aren't being afforded to me as part of my contract with the type of plane ticket, that kind of stuff. All of that's going to suddenly, I think, be part of the rider market considerations.
The reality is there are 5 riders in the 2026 grid whose contracts expire at the end of the season.
Yeah.
There are places for these people should they need to find other options, and you got to think that there is a very distinct possibility that Jack Miller gets shafted 2 years in a row by KTM despite not even riding for them anymore.
Yes.
Because him and Franco Morbidelli have to be, two of the obvious ones that are going to lose out is if there's a reshuffling, and Brad Binder and Pedro Acosta in particular have to find spaces in the grid again. It's going to be, it's going to be a bit of a bloodbath, but teams are going to do what teams do. They're going to be mercenary, and they're going to find, spaces for bigger names with more proven records.
For me, the interesting part of this is, I would say, the one manufacturer that I would be most confident in not breaking contracts or not looking for a way to break contracts would be Honda. And Honda's the one that doesn't really have much in the way of contracts in the books. Luca Marini's expires at the end of 2025. Johan Zarco's expires at the end of 2025. I mean, Tomkia Chantra is a different consideration because of the Idemitsu-funded nature of that particular ride, but he is also, as far as we know, on a 1 year sort of agreement. Presumably there'll be some options there.
Maybe. Yeah, he's in a 1+1.
Yeah, so that +1 can take, I think, a few forms. It could be performance +1. It could be Lucio Cicinello unilateral decision +1. Could be Honda unilateral decision +1. Could be both parties agreeing +1. It's, and again, he's actually the one that, assuming the level of performance is respectable, I would just expect to keep the ride most times. But I mean, Honda's not massively attractive in terms of the bike you can offer, but sometimes, beggars can't be choosers. And if somehow, if that their standard report is in fact correct, and if 2026 is an exit date, not 2027, 2026, and you get the 4 riders entering the market in 2026, while presumably still getting a decent enough payout, you can't just break the contract, can you? Then they enter the market even sort of untethered to immediate financial demands, but also Honda is in a position to meet the financial requirements, especially now that it's saved very recently on a 4th year of Marc Marquez, very, very rightly so. Are we going to get a Maverick Vinales at Honda, for instance, finally? Are we going to see Brad Binder become the new face of the Honda project somehow? There's a lot of those things that are going on. Are we going to see, as Simon mentioned, for instance, Franco Morbidelli getting sidelined for a return of Enea Bastianini, a proven Ducati winner, into the Ducati fold? Or is this something where Valentino Rossi would put the foot down and go, no, my guy stays, he's my guy? Because, again, it's hard to see VR46 for me field a lineup that's no VR46 Academy riders. That part, really, I struggle with it. But they do have an Indonesian sponsor that wants results attached to them, so that's also, it's complicated for me.
There is another factor where if KTM do disappear in 2026 completely, then that's also where we go back to the previous conversation, and there is potential for, say, Lewis Hamilton Ducati to appear in the grid.
Yeah.
Because if there's 2 spaces going in this grid, Ducati will try and throw 2 more bikes at it again.
That's true. Ducati's not cut down to 6
bikes.
No,
somebody has to, if that happens, somebody has to rehome Tech 3, don't they?
Yeah.
In some capacity.
Or the 67-year-old Hervé Poncharal has to decide that he wants to start over again and continue to keep the team going rather than, for example, selling it off and rebranding it into something else. I think there will not be 4 bikes won't disappear from the grid at once.
Yeah.
There's no way that'll be allowed to happen. And you'd think that if Tech 3 were back in the market or their successor in any form, that Ducati would be immediately interested in trying to make that happen. So there won't be a need for people to find their way onto 6 bikes or onto 2 bikes. You gotta think Ducati would go all in on putting together a satellite package for Pedro Acosta.
I mean, people will mention, and they do mention that, Ducati has scaled down in various ways, but only part of that has been by its own volition. It has scaled down by its own volition to 3 factory bikes, 3 non-factory bikes. That's a money decision, but it didn't lose a 4th team by its own decision. It lost the 4th team because Pramac got a better offer at Yamaha. Mm-hmm. Ducati was ready and willing and happy to continue with 8 bikes, with 4 outfits. They're, especially, if push comes to shove, if the situation gets dire, I mean, maybe we'll see a return of MotoGP where there's a 2-year-old bike on the grid, for instance. I mean, maybe that could be the most cost-effective way of doing it. Maybe it'll still be, reasonably competitive. I mean, that would still be in 2026. That would still be a GP24. That's fine. It's not a bad machine.
Also, with if manufacturers are winding down development a little bit ahead of the 2027 rules, and with the engine freeze as well, we are potentially going into a year where 2-year-old bikes are not that big a deal. Yeah. You mentioned Ducati finding a way to get Acosta on one of its bikes. I think you've got two very, very different situations with the 4 riders involved here. Bastianini, Vinales, Binder. Everyone's going to be interested in those 3, whether you're a manufacturer or a satellite team. You're going to take a look and go, would they do better than my guy? Possibly. Val, you said this is the lineup with the strongest kind of average. I see it as KTM's the one manufacturer that goes into every weekend going, if our bike was good, any 4 of our guys could win. Yep. Every other manufacturer has at least one rider where you're like, they're probably not ready to win yet, or they need to prove themselves against. KTM, they're not all perfect, but they've got 4 potential winners every weekend. So everyone will take a sniff at those 3 KTM riders. Acosta is a different matter. Acosta has a ton of power here, because if you're whatever manufacturer, including Ducati, you do not want to go into the end of the 2020s with Pedro Acosta on another competitive bike that could be beating yours, because he is a rider who can make a difference. He is a Marc Marquez type. So if Pedro Acosta is on the market, I kind of don't see a situation where Ducati doesn't somehow get him, because it will want to future-proof itself, keep its dominance, and it's got the most appealing package right now. Because if you're Pedro Acosta, you've got enough power that you're not stepping onto a Honda or a Yamaha as a project if those 2 teams aren't showing hugely obvious, clear proof that they'll be right at the front again in 26, 27. And no one can show clear proof of 27 because it's entirely unknown.
But is Acosta, in terms of his career path, in a position to make a Marc Marquez-style decision of, I don't really care what the earnings will be this season, I just want a good bike, even if it's like a satellite team good bike? I mean, I can't imagine Ducati matching a salary for a satellite rider, especially that one of the Japanese manufacturers could offer Acosta, and that would be a consideration. I don't know, would the scenario be to have Red Bull sponsor quite heavily his entry wherever it is, and then Red Bull cover most of it, but then in the future down the line you see a situation where, what if his ultimate ambition is to go into the works team, where we've just now seen with Marc Marquez that a Red Bull rider does not go because it is sponsored by Monster Energy. Would that be resolved in time? I mean, all of the sponsor things, they can be resolved when there's a competitive will, but sometimes there isn't a competitive will. Again, with Marc Marquez, it takes a guy who has raked in already massive earnings and only has the view of, competitive benefits now at his age, which I'm saying like it's some sort of hugely advanced age. It isn't. He's 31 or 30? Yeah, 31. Should be 31. But Acosta's not 31, and we've seen with Fabio Quartararo very recently how that kind of thing impacts your thinking. But Quartararo already has a title. Acosta will want one quite soon, or at least a real shot at one, which is also part of this current situation, because does Acosta sit at home right now and think, despite the fact that KTM has no money to spend, I can win a title here in 25 or 26. In 25 or 26. Does he think that? Should he think that? Would I think that if I was him? Probably not, right? Would you, if you were Pedro Acosta right now, either of you, and you're sitting at home right now, and you read the Austrian Creditor Union report because you have nothing better to do, because that's what MotoGP riders do in their spare time. Do you think, well, it's still fine, we still have a real shot here in 25, 26, when a full might KTM wasn't really enough in recent years?
No, if I'm Pedro Acosta, from everything he said since he started racing, no part of me is going, I'm quite pretty young, I've got time, I can wait to see how this plays out. Every part of me as Pedro Acosta is going, how do I win a championship as soon as possible? Yeah. This doesn't look like the option anymore. How do I get somewhere that is going to get me a championship as soon as possible? I don't have time to waste because I'm too good to waste time. That's what I'll be thinking if I was Pedro anyway. By the way, listeners, I should say we did promise you we'd start 2025 with a bunch of predictions to questions that the Race Members Club on Patreon set for us. If you want to have opportunities like that, if you want to hear us reliving the entire 2015 season, which we're about to start recording next week, come and join us in the Race Members Club. Either find the race on Patreon or go to the-race.com/members-club. We will run that episode with our predictions. It is in the can. We'll make some adjustments to it and run it next week, but we wanted to jump on this KTM situation almost before anything else happened, effectively, and just to keep you updated with all the things that, as Val said at the outset, had been kind of dripping out over the Christmas period. You guys rightly say that MotoGP will not face a 4-bike grid drop because there is enough capacity for Tech 3 or whatever to find a new home. There are satellite solutions. Can MotoGP afford to, in whichever year, 26, 27 or whenever, can it afford to go down to 4 manufacturers if KTM's wait and see project doesn't come off? And if it can't go down to 4 manufacturers, does it have options for a 5th nearby at this point?
I mean, Dorna MotoGP don't get a choice in the matter. That's the reality. If it goes to 4, then they have about as much say over it as they did over Suzuki walking away, in that they have no say over it whatsoever. So they're going to be watching this as closely as we are. They're going to be a little bit nervous that the sale to Liberty Media isn't already completed, because a MotoGP with 4 manufacturers is less valuable than a MotoGP with 5, especially whenever the one that is potentially disappearing is one that has such a big impact up and down the grid and up and down the classes. I know that there are other projects out there that are sniffing around a MotoGP entry at the minute. There has been persistent talk, obviously, about BMW, although I think they're not exactly flush with cash at the minute either, and I think that maybe has put a bit of a dampener on their MotoGP ambitions. There are, like I say, there are other things happening that I know about but can't really say too much about at this point, because that's the nature of finding out stuff sometimes. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see a Liberty-owned MotoGP potentially trying to go down the route of being a bit more small, a bit more boutique whenever it comes to manufacturers. To basically take that F1 model, to rely on a bit of heritage and to build bikes that are, not designed to sell superbikes, but designed to support a MotoGP team structure that is a financially viable business model in and of itself, without needing the might of Honda or KTM to keep it going.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, that's probably that's the way you safeguard your championship against the natural volatilities of various, manufacturers boards and various, market forces, is ultimately you have a grid made up of racers over marketers. And that's not to say any of the current guys aren't racers. It's just, how it is. It's you've seen it in all sorts of motorsport categories. There's nothing you can do to prevent them from walking away when they have to go. When the board has decided they have to go, or maybe in this KTM particular case, when there's no money for reasons that have nothing to do with the MotoGP program, well, what can you do? There's nothing. The MotoGP we've seen, ultimately, 4 manufacturers. I know that sounds like apologism, I guess, but 4 manufacturers is still kind of a lot, isn't it?
Oh, it is.
We've been through MotoGP. We've been through eras of MotoGP where the number of relevant manufacturers have sometimes been 2 or 1.
Yeah.
I mean, there were others, but the relevant ones, the ones that were actually capable of impacting the outcome of the race in any way, the ones that got any screen time, there'd be like 2 or 3. It's not ideal if you end up going from 6 to 4 in such a short span of time, but that's part and parcel of being a manufacturer-dominated series. You could still do a lot worse than 4. I mean, look, I watched some DTM with 2 manufacturers. Wasn't fantastic, but I guess you can get by with all sorts of numbers and still put out a viable product out there. And 4, you can certainly do worse than 4.
Yeah. We talked about the 6-4-24 dream a while ago, where Dorna wanted 6 manufacturers, each fielding 4 bikes to make a 24 bike grid, and it nearly had that for a while. But Suzuki's exit first showed that it's asking a lot for any motorsport series to get 6 manufacturers at all and then make sure they can all field 4 entries, and none of them want to field fewer or more than 4. That was a little bit too utopian. Ultimately, as we've seen with things like the CRT era, Dorna will do what it needs to do to get 20-ish bikes on a grid, and for as many of them to be competitive as possible. But pragmatically, it wants a full grid. Liberty as well. Liberty seems to like, on its F1 business, it likes manufacturers. We've seen a debate in F1 over whether a particular new team should be allowed in, and now that new team is allowed in. Now it is very much a manufacturer. Whether that was the manufacturer element was a big red herring for personality clashes that was stopping a particular independent team coming in is a different conversation. But in terms of like getting Audi on board and that sort of thing, Liberty likes manufacturers for F1. Whether MotoGP will be the same case, you can't assume. Ultimately, Liberty will want a MotoGP that has some enough good bikes on a grid, however they're provided. We don't want to overlook the impact beyond MotoGP in racing terms of what is going on at KTM. Obviously, there's focus on the headline of, is the MotoGP team going to continue in whatever form? But KTM is an enormous part of the rest of the Grand Prix racing ladder. We mentioned we postponed our predictions episode. Another thing in the pipeline for the start of January was an episode all about the rising stars outside MotoGP, who the next generation will be. We've got David Alonso, Moto3 champion interview, which we'll put out in full on the Members Club and give you some snippets of in our main feed. We're going to revisit exclusive Pedro Acosta gave us before he started his MotoGP career and see how his vibe there compares to what he actually achieved. That will come up at some point during the preseason, but we want to get KTM addressed first. So that one is on ice for now, but we'll definitely bring it to you before testing or before the season opener. But Val, just for any listeners who aren't aware of the situation beyond MotoGP, KTM's involvement is absolutely vast in the pipeline, isn't it? No one else is as important.
No one else. It's, ultimately at every level of Grand Prix racing, there is some sort of KTM influence, usually like different levels. It used to have a Moto2 manufacturer program that was closed down, but it still retains support for certain Moto2 teams and provides them with riders that are contracted to KTM or to Red Bull KTM on some sort of version of the two. And obviously that includes the factory KTM Moto2 team. I don't know if you can call it factory. We call it factory, but it's not, because it's Calix's, it's not KTM's, so it's factory in a sense. But yeah, the IO team that is a major player every year. In Moto3, the KTM bikes, whatever they're badged as, KTMs, Husqvarnas, etc., they tend to dominate. They win races, they win championships. They usually are marginally more competitive right now than their Honda counterparts, and it's KTM and Honda that make up the whole grid. And then on the level below Moto3, you have other like regional Moto3 type series, but you also have the Red Bull Rookies Cup that supports much of the MotoGP season, which is just a joint Red Bull KTM project with a selection of riders all running in same Red Bull liveries. I mean, all of those bikes already exist. Like, you don't need to build them, but you need to service them, you need to replace them, etc. You would need somebody like Red Bull to step up, I presume, with various aspects of that series. And that's a very important series, Red Bull Rookies Cup in particular. That's a series that is, in a way, responsible for... I didn't do quite the full numbers because I'm lazy, but it feels like half the MotoGP grid at least has been in Red Bull Rookies Cup in some form. And of the other half, the reason they haven't is because they've been through it before it existed, for instance. So... that's a part of the ladder that will need to be shorn up, and obviously Moto3 will need to be massively shorn up in some way, because they're not ultimately, the bikes do exist, they're still there, but it's not like KTM and Honda don't work on those bikes.
I think that given the level of investment that they do put into it, and the fact that it's a one make series, I think it can kind of survive for a while with just Red Bull.
You mean the Rookies Cup?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they could take the bikes that they've got, they keep running them in that spec. You speak to the Rookies Cup riders, and they already complain like only teenage kids can about how the bikes are slower than what they're racing in Junior GP because they're a bit older and a bit underdeveloped and whatever. But that's fine. For what it is, that's fine. And I think that at least buys Red Bull quite a bit of time in that regard. So, regardless of what happens elsewhere, I'd be very surprised if we see Rookies Cup disappearing.
But in Moto3, I mean, there is sort of a mini development race between Honda and KTM every given year, which would have to not be a thing anymore.
The good thing about it is that KTM are conclusively winning it.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
The KTM is a lot better in Moto3 spec. Yeah. So there's a lot more time to let Honda catch up there. They've got even more sort of breathing room there than they do in MotoGP. But for me, the Moto3 project is the bit of the whole thing where, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the only bit of the entire Grand Prix racing program where they at least break even, if not make a bit of a profit, because they're selling customer bikes. They're selling very, very good customer bikes. Dorna will be financially incentivized to ensure that KTM keep making Moto3 bikes because they don't want Moto3 to become a one-make series that's only Honda. I mean, I don't even think Honda want that because I don't know if they have the actual manufacturing capability to build that many Moto3 bikes to full an entire grid. So I'd be really, really surprised if there's a substantial impact on Moto3 at any time in the near future, given that, in a smart world, they should be at least making a bit of money off it.
Yeah, this is you can look at the number of KTMs on grids in the Grand Prix package from MotoGP down to Rookies Cup and go, if all those KTMs disappear overnight going to 26 or whatever, I mean, that's like 30-odd bikes that if you look at the full Rookies Cup field, more than that we would lose overnight. We wouldn't necessarily lose overnight because some of the model here is, like you say, these bikes are made by KTM, then sold to customers, they break even at least, and that presumably could continue with some tweaks. So it's not quite the apocalypse it could be, but given the fact the Rookies Cup is a KTM thing, and given that Jorge Martin, the world champion, kind of credits the Rookies Cup with the fact he's even got into racing as high as he did at all, as it's an opportunity he wouldn't have had to progress without that, given the situation he was in. It just feels like if KTM is not doing what it's done for the last decade in 2 years' time, the route to becoming a MotoGP rider suddenly gets quite a lot harder. Is that fair to say?
I think that the strength is that Junior GP, what used to be the Spanish Moto3 Championship, has got stronger.
Yeah.
And that's a credible route in as well. But it's not a free route. And that's maybe the biggest issue.
Yeah.
Especially if you're from if you're not Spanish, essentially. But I don't know. I don't see... I don't think that worrying about the impact this is all going to have on Rookies Cup is the pressing concern right now, because I think we've got time. That's where KTM will step in. That's where KTM do like to be involved. That's where they like to create ambassadors at a very young age.
Red Bull.
Yeah, Red Bull.
Right.
So I think there's loads of time there. I think that the other thing is we've also seen it is obviously KTM machinery and KTM machinery and Red Bull money, but it is essentially a Dorna run series.
Yeah. And
Dorna have run similar series and do run similar series on other machinery. The American Town Cup ran on Aprilias. The Asia Town Cup runs on Hondas. Red Bull Rookies won't go anywhere. Maybe it rebrands. Maybe it changes manufacturer. It's not going anywhere. That's not the concern here at all for me.
Yeah, and if it's a question of riders getting the opportunities that, well, again, I mean, partly Red Bull funding provides through the ranks as Red Bull athletes, but obviously also KTM's self-interest. You have a manufacturer that is more involved than anyone else in getting riders gradually through the ranks, and then sometimes having those riders poached by other manufacturers who are sitting there waiting for the fruits of that labor, whoever's surplus to requirements. That's a thing that KTM I think has already specifically referenced as that cannot happen again. That cannot keep happening, especially with the situation that we're in. We cannot be developing and producing riders for other manufacturers. So that will change the landscape in a way, although, again, recently you would say that KTM has been able to get the guys that it specifically wants, the non-surplus guys, and keep them in the program. It got Val Khorounzhiy into MotoGP, just not for very long with them, but he did graduate. He was their sort of prized asset. Pedro Acosta is their prized asset. He is in the MotoGP program and is the centerpiece of that MotoGP program. I don't know what the situation is with David Alonso, how strong that tie is, but that's academic now, potentially. I was
going to say less strong than it was before.
Yeah. But it's
billions started being quoted in newspaper figures, I imagine.
Yeah, but it's not going to break the whole system, obviously.
No.
There will be... Ultimately, somebody will be winning Moto3 and somebody will be winning Moto2, and then MotoGP factories will be signing those people to contracts.
And to be quite mercenary about the whole thing, a feeder series producing talent for Moto3 that's a bit more agnostic than the KTM controlled system might not actually be a bad thing for the sport. Because, they do have this dominance, and it does create weird contract situations and messy circumstances. So actually, if it was a bit looser, if it was a manufacturer that didn't care as much about, retaining the talent, not the end of the world.
So I think that's given us all a good summary, listeners. Thanks, Val. Thanks, Simon, for all your insight on all of that. I think we can rule out the prospect of a Lewis Hamilton rescue package where he walks into the KTM factory with a massive multi-billion euro check tomorrow. Everything is fine. We see no difference in competitiveness, and Lewis becomes Pedro Acosta's boss. It would be quite fun. We can also
that would be awesome, though.
Rule out a situation where we start the season with a load of KTMs disappearing from all four parts of the MotoGP ladder. It's going to be somewhere in between. It might not be as bad as it looked, but still not great for everyone involved in KTM. And obviously, when we talk about the racing future, go on, Val.
KTM LH44, half of it's Red Bull backed for all the KTM Red Bull stuff. Half of it's Monster backed for Lewis Hamilton's personal sponsor.
Oh, yeah.
Just a half and half bike. Beautiful.
Yeah. If we thought Marc Marquez's Monster versus Red Bull thing was complicated, that would be a lot more complicated.
Well, again, this is one of the things that Pit Buyer brought up as not being an option, not being an issue specifically, which for me, again, is one of the things you say when you're just publicly trying to drum up interest in outside investment into your racing program.
Yeah, no, fair point. We'll be back in your ears early next week with our predictions episode, which, as we've knocked it back after recording it, hopefully none of them have been disproved or proved to be lunacy in this 2 weeks when no racing's been happening. Back in your ears then. Thank you for your company, listeners.
The Athletic.